Daniel had been playing piano for as long as he could remember. His fingers knew the keys better than anything else in this world. When he was just a little boy, barely tall enough to reach the pedals, his grandmother would sit beside him on that old wooden bench, guiding his small hands across the ivory keys. She always told him that music wasn't just about playing the right notes. It was about feeling them, living them, breathing life into every single sound that came from that beautiful instrument. Now at 32 years old, Daniel was still chasing that dream his grandmother had helped him plant all those years ago. But dreams, he had learned, didn't pay the rent. Every morning he would wake up in his cramped studio apartment, barely bigger than a closet, and the first thing he'd see was that old upright piano squeezed against the wall. It was the same piano his grandmother had given him before she died. The keys were worn, some of the ivory was chipped, and it desperately needed tuning, but it was his most precious possession. It was all he had left of her. During the day, Daniel worked at an upscale Italian restaurant downtown. He wasn't a chef or a manager. He was a waiter, rushing between tables, balancing heavy trays, forcing smiles at customers who barely acknowledged his existence. His feet would ache by the end of every shift, and his pockets would jingle with tips that never seemed to be quite enough. The irony wasn't lost on him. Here he was, a classically trained pianist asking people if they wanted extra Parmesan on their pasta. His co-workers were nice enough. They knew about his music, about his Tuesday night gigs at the coffee shop down the street. Some of them had even come to watch him play once or twice. They'd clap politely, tell him he was talented, and then he'd see that look in their eyes. That sad, knowing look that said they'd seen 100 guys just like him, dreamers, artists, people who were still waiting for their big break while the years slipped away like sand. Through their fingers, every Tuesday night without fail, Daniel would finish his shift, change out of his uniform, and walk 3 blocks to the Riverside Coffee House. It was a cozy little place with mismatched furniture, the smell of fresh espresso always hanging in the air, and a small corner where they let local musicians perform. The owner, an older woman named Betty, had been letting Daniel play there for almost 3 years now. She never paid him, but she'd always make sure he got free coffee and whatever pastries were left over from the day. The audiences were small, sometimes just 5 or 6 people scattered around the room, buried in their laptops or lost in conversation with friends. Daniel would play his heart out, pouring every ounce of emotion into pieces by Chopin, Debussy, Rachmaninoff. He'd play his own compositions too, melodies that came to him in the middle of the night, stories without words that he desperately wanted to share with the world. But most people just kept typing, kept talking, kept living their lives as if his music was nothing more than pleasant background noise. There were moments, though, beautiful, fleeting moments when someone would actually stop and listen, when he'd look up from the keys and see a stranger with tears in their eyes, completely lost in the music. Those moments made everything worthwhile. They reminded him why he kept going, kept believing, kept playing even when it felt like no one cared. His younger brother, Robert, couldn't understand it. Robert was everything Daniel wasn't: successful, practical, grounded in reality. At just 28, Robert had already built a thriving real estate business. He drove a nice car, lived in a beautiful house, wore expensive suits, and had his whole life mapped out in neat, organized steps. Family dinners were always awkward because their mother would inevitably start comparing them, asking Daniel when he was going to get serious about his future. Robert meant well. Daniel knew that. At least once a month, his brother would call with the same offer. "Come work with me," Robert would say. "I need someone I can trust. The pay is good, the hours are flexible. You could still play music on the side, but at least you'd have stability." And every time Daniel would politely decline, trying to explain that music wasn't just a hobby for him. It wasn't something he did on the side. It was who he was, down to his very core. But lately, those conversations had been getting harder. Lately, Daniel had started wondering if Robert was right. Maybe he was being foolish. Maybe it was time to grow up, accept reality, and stop chasing a dream that was never going to come true. The final straw came on a rainy Thursday afternoon. Daniel was at home, practicing a new piece he'd been working on when his landlord knocked on the door. Mr. Patterson was a gruff man in his 60s who owned the entire building. He'd always been fair to Daniel, never raising the rent too much, understanding when Daniel was a few days late with payment. But the look on his face that day told Daniel something was wrong. "I need to talk to you about something," Mr. Patterson said, not quite meeting Daniel's eyes. I've sold the building. New owners are taking over next month, and they're planning to renovate, turn these units into luxury apartments. I'm sorry, kid, but you've got 60 days to find a new place. Daniel felt like the floor had dropped out from under him. 60 days. 2 months to find a new apartment in a city where rent prices had been skyrocketing for years. And it wasn't just about finding any apartment. He needed a place that would allow his piano. Most buildings had strict noise policies. Some wouldn't allow large instruments at all. His beloved piano, the last gift from his grandmother, was about to become the very thing that made him homeless. That night, Daniel couldn't sleep. He sat at his piano, playing softly so as not to disturb the neighbors, tears streaming down his face. He thought about his grandmother, about all the sacrifices she'd made to pay for his lessons when he was young. He thought about the thousands of hours he'd spent practicing, the college degree in music performance, the competitions he'd won that had led absolutely nowhere. He thought about every Tuesday night at the coffee shop, every ignored performance, every polite smile that was really just pity in disguise. For the first time in his life, Daniel seriously considered giving up. Maybe music was supposed to be a young man's game. Maybe he'd had his chance and missed it. Maybe it was time to call Robert, accept that job offer, and resign himself to being just another person who'd once had a dream, but learned to live without it. The thought made him feel hollow inside, like something essential was being carved out of his chest, but what choice did he have? He pulled out his phone and stared at Robert's number for a long time. His thumb hovered over the call button. Just one press, one conversation, and his life could take a completely different direction. Stable, predictable, safe. Everything his music had never been. But he didn't press it. Not that night. Instead, Daniel made himself a promise. He had 60 days before he had to move. 60 days to figure out his life. He would give himself that much time, play every Tuesday like it might be his last, and see what happened. If nothing changed, if no miracle arrived, then maybe it really would be time to let go of this dream and join the real world. What Daniel didn't know was that sometimes the universe has a strange way of working. Sometimes when you're at your absolute lowest point, when you're ready to give up everything you've ever believed in, that's exactly when everything changes. And for Daniel, that change was just around the corner, waiting in a place he never expected to find it. 3 weeks had passed since Daniel received the news about his apartment, and he still hadn't found anywhere to live that he could afford. Every listing he called about either didn't allow pets or large instruments, or the rent was so high it made his head spin. He'd started packing his belongings into boxes, each one a reminder that time was running out. The piano sat in the corner unmoved, because he couldn't bear to think about what he'd do with it if he couldn't find the right place. On a Saturday morning, Daniel woke up feeling completely exhausted. He'd worked a double shift the night before, and his body ached from carrying heavy trays for 12 straight hours. He was scrolling through his phone, half-heartedly looking at apartment listings he knew he couldn't afford, when he saw something unusual. A sponsored post about an estate sale at the historic Whitmore Mansion on the north side of the city. Daniel had heard of the Whitmore estate his whole life. Everyone in the city had. It was this legendary old mansion that sat on 5 acres of prime real estate, surrounded by iron gates and old oak trees. The Whitmore family had been wealthy for generations, the kind of old money that most people only read about in books. Rumor had it that the last member of the family, an elderly man who'd lived there alone for years, was finally selling the property. The post mentioned that the house would be open for viewing before the official auction, and anyone could come tour the grounds. Daniel wasn't sure why he clicked on it. He certainly wasn't in the market to buy a mansion. He could barely afford his tiny studio apartment, but something in the post caught his attention. It mentioned that the estate had an extensive collection of rare instruments and artwork. As a musician, Daniel had always been fascinated by historic instruments. He'd read articles about the famous pianos that had been played by the masters, dreaming about what it would feel like to touch those keys. He checked his work schedule. He wasn't due at the restaurant until 5 that evening. The estate viewing started at 10 in the morning. Before he could talk himself out of it, Daniel decided to go. Maybe it would take his mind off his problems for a few hours. Maybe seeing how the other half lived would give him some perspective. Or maybe he just needed to get out of his apartment before the walls closed in on him completely. Daniel threw on the nicest clothes he owned, a pair of dark jeans without any holes, a button-down shirt he usually saved for job interviews, and a jacket he'd bought at a thrift store that was only slightly too big for him. He looked at himself in the mirror and laughed bitterly. Even in his best outfit, he looked exactly like what he was, a struggling musician pretending to be someone he wasn't. The mansion was even more impressive in person than it looked in the photos. Daniel parked his beat-up old car several blocks away, not wanting to embarrass himself by pulling up in front of the estate in a vehicle that was held together by duct tape and prayers. As he walked up the long driveway, he passed luxury cars that probably cost more than he'd earn in 10 years. Mercedes, BMWs, even a Bentley. His stomach churned with anxiety, but he kept walking. The front entrance was massive, with columns that stretched up 2 stories and doors made of dark, carved wood. A young woman in a crisp business suit stood at the entrance with a clipboard, checking people in. Daniel gave her his name, trying not to notice the way her eyes flickered over his appearance with barely concealed judgment. She handed him a brochure and waved him inside without a word. The interior took his breath away. Crystal chandeliers hung from ceilings painted with elaborate murals. Marble floors reflected the light streaming through enormous windows. Every room was filled with antique furniture, oil paintings in gold frames, and objects that looked like they belonged in a museum. Daniel wandered through the halls, feeling more out of place with every step. The other visitors were exactly what he expected. Wealthy couples in designer clothes, discussing the property in hushed tones with real estate agents trailing behind them. Business people in expensive suits, making calculations on their phones about renovation costs and investment potential. A few elderly collectors examining the artwork and furniture, with the practiced eyes of people who knew exactly what everything was worth. Daniel caught snippets of conversation as he moved through the rooms. Someone was planning to tear down the whole interior and modernize it. Another person wanted to convert it into a boutique hotel. Everyone seemed to see the mansion as nothing more than a business opportunity, a way to turn old beauty into new money. It made him sad in a way he couldn't quite explain. He'd been wandering for about 20 minutes trying to stay out of everyone's way when he found himself in a long hallway lined with closed doors. Most of the other visitors were gathered in the main rooms, so this part of the house was quiet. Daniel tried a few door handles, peeking into bedrooms and sitting rooms, each more elaborate than the last. Then he opened a door at the end of the hall, and everything changed. The room was flooded with natural light from floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out onto an overgrown garden. Vines had climbed up the outside of the glass, creating patterns of shadow and light on the hardwood floor. Old bookshelves lined the walls, filled with sheet music and leather-bound volumes. But Daniel barely noticed any of that, because right in the center of the room, positioned perfectly to catch the afternoon sun, sat the most beautiful piano he'd ever seen. It was a Steinway grand piano, the kind of instrument most musicians only dream about playing. The wood was polished to a deep, rich shine. The keys looked pristine, barely touched. Daniel approached it slowly, almost reverently, like he was approaching something sacred. His heart was pounding in his chest. He'd seen pianos like this in concert halls, in recordings of famous performances, but he'd never been this close to one in real life. Without thinking, he reached out and gently touched the surface. The wood was smooth and cool under his fingers. He wondered how many people had played this instrument over the years, what kind of music had filled this room, whose fingers had last pressed these keys. "Excuse me. Please don't touch that." A sharp voice cut through the silence like a knife. Daniel jumped back, his face flushing with embarrassment. A woman in an expensive-looking pantsuit was striding toward him, her heels clicking sharply on the hardwood floor. She was probably in her 40s, with perfectly styled hair and the kind of confidence that came from years of telling people what to do. Behind her, a small group of wealthy-looking visitors had gathered in the doorway, drawn by the commotion. "That instrument is part of the estate sale," the woman said coldly. "It's extremely valuable. This is a viewing, not a touching zoo. Are you here with one of the prospective buyers?" The implication in her voice was crystal clear. Someone like Daniel, in his thrift store jacket and worn shoes, couldn't possibly be here on his own merit. He must be someone's assistant, someone's driver, someone who'd wandered away from where he was supposed to be. The assumption stung even though he knew she was right. He didn't belong here. Daniel opened his mouth to apologize, to explain that he just wanted to see the piano up close, but before he could speak, he heard someone laugh. It was a couple standing in the doorway, both dressed in clothing that probably cost more than Daniel's monthly rent. The woman had her hand over her mouth, trying to hide her amusement, but her eyes were mocking. The man beside her was shaking his head, a smirk on his face, like Daniel was the punchline to a joke they were all sharing. Something inside Daniel snapped. It wasn't a loud, dramatic break. It was quiet and deep, like a string that had been pulled too tight for too long finally giving way. He was tired of being invisible, tired of being dismissed, tired of apologizing for wanting something beautiful. He'd spent his entire life being told his music didn't matter, that his dreams were impractical, that he should accept his place and stop reaching for things that weren't meant for people like him. He looked at the woman with the clipboard, then at the laughing couple, then back at the piano. And he made a decision that would change everything. "I'd like to play it," Daniel said quietly. His voice didn't shake. Just for a moment, the estate agent's eyebrows shot up so high they almost disappeared into her hairline. "Absolutely not," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "This is a private viewing for serious buyers. I'm going to have to ask you to let him play." Everyone turned toward the new voice. An elderly man was standing in the doorway, leaning heavily on a wooden cane that looked as old and distinguished as he did. He must have been in his 80s, with white hair and a face lined with the kind of wrinkles that came from a lifetime of both laughter and sorrow. Despite his age, there was something powerful about his presence, something that made everyone in the room immediately quiet down. Daniel would later learn that this was William Whitmore himself, the last living member of the family, the man who'd lived in this mansion his entire life. The estate agent looked flustered. "Mr. Whitmore, I really don't think that's appropriate. We have a schedule to maintain, and it's my piano." The old man interrupted gently but firmly. "And it's still my house, at least for a few more weeks. I'd like to hear someone play it one last time before it goes to strangers who'll probably just sell it off to the highest bidder." He looked directly at Daniel, and there was something in his eyes. Kindness, maybe, or curiosity, or perhaps recognition of something he saw in this young stranger standing in his music room. "Please," William said. "I insist." The room fell completely silent. The laughing couple wasn't smiling anymore. The estate agent looked like she wanted to argue but didn't dare. Everyone was staring at Daniel, waiting to see what would happen next. Some faces showed curiosity, others showed annoyance at the interruption, and a few still showed that mocking amusement, like they were waiting for him to embarrass himself. Daniel's hands were trembling as he walked toward the piano bench. Daniel's legs felt like they might give out as he walked toward the piano bench. Every eye in the room was on him, and he could feel the weight of their judgment pressing down on his shoulders. The couple who'd been laughing at him had moved closer, probably expecting some kind of spectacle, some confirmation that he was exactly what they thought he was, a nobody who'd stumbled into a world where he didn't belong. He sat down slowly, adjusting the bench just slightly. The leather cushion was soft, nothing like the worn wooden bench at home or the wobbly stool at the coffee shop. His fingers hovered over the keys for a moment, and he could feel his heart hammering so hard he was sure everyone could hear it. This wasn't like playing at the Riverside Coffee House where nobody was really listening anyway. This wasn't even like the small recitals he'd done back in college. This was different, terrifying, real. What should he play? His mind raced through possibilities. Something classical and safe? A Chopin nocturne that he knew by heart? Maybe some Beethoven to show he had technical skill? But even as he considered these options, he knew they weren't right. Playing it safe had gotten him nowhere in life. Playing what other people expected had left him invisible, ignored, just another pianist playing other people's music. No, if he was going to do this, if he was going to play in front of these people who'd already decided he was nothing, then he was going to play something true, something that mattered. Daniel closed his eyes and let his fingers find the keys. The first notes came out soft, almost whisper quiet, like a conversation starting in the dark. It was a piece he'd written 3 years ago, right after his grandmother died. He'd never performed it for anyone. It was too personal, too raw, too much of his actual soul poured into music. He called it Grandmother's Garden, because she used to tell him stories about the garden she'd had as a young woman, before she moved to the city, before life had worn away so many of her dreams. The melody started simple and melancholic, painting a picture of memory and loss. His left hand provided a gentle foundation while his right hand traced out the main theme, fragile and beautiful, like something you were afraid might break if you held it too tightly. Daniel forgot about the people watching. He forgot about the estate agent with her clipboard and her disapproval. He forgot about the laughing couple and the mansion and everything else. There was only the music and the memories it carried. The piece began to build. His grandmother had been a fighter, someone who'd survived poverty and war and heartbreak, who'd worked 3 jobs to help pay for his piano lessons when his parents couldn't afford them. The music reflected that strength, the melody becoming more insistent, more powerful. His hands moved faster across the keys, the dynamics swelling from piano to forte, from whisper to declaration. There was a section in the middle where the music turned almost angry, almost defiant. This was the part he'd written when he was furious at the world for taking her away, furious at himself for all the times he'd been too busy to visit, furious at the unfairness of losing the one person who'd always believed in him without question. The Steinway responded beautifully to every emotion he poured into it, the sound filling the room with a richness he'd never experienced on his old, upright piano at home. Then came the resolution. The anger couldn't last forever. Grief had to find a way to transform into something else, something softer but no less powerful. The melody shifted into a bittersweet acceptance, acknowledging the loss while celebrating what had been. His grandmother's voice seemed to echo in the music, all the things she'd told him over the years. Play from your heart, not from your head. Music isn't about being perfect. It's about being honest. Don't let anyone tell you that beauty doesn't matter. The final phrases came out like a prayer, gentle and reverent. Daniel let the last notes hang in the air, sustaining them with the pedal until they faded naturally into silence. Only then did he open his eyes and remember where he was. The room was completely still. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. It was as if time itself had stopped, holding its breath. Daniel turned slightly on the bench, almost afraid to look at the faces of the people who'd been watching. What he saw shocked him. The estate agent, who'd been so cold and dismissive just minutes ago, had her hand pressed against her chest, her eyes wide and glistening with unshed tears. The man from the laughing couple was staring at the floor, his jaw clenched tight, and his wife had turned away slightly, wiping at her eyes with trembling fingers. An older woman Daniel hadn't noticed before was openly crying, not bothering to hide the tears streaming down her face. A middle-aged businessman in an expensive suit had taken off his glasses and was cleaning them unnecessarily, clearly using it as an excuse to compose himself. Even the young woman with the clipboard who'd checked Daniel in at the entrance was standing in the doorway now, one hand covering her mouth. But it was William Whitmore's reaction that hit Daniel the hardest. The elderly man had moved closer during the performance, and now he was standing right beside the piano, leaning heavily on his cane. His weathered face was wet with tears, and he made no attempt to wipe them away. He was looking at Daniel with an expression so intense, so full of emotion that it was almost difficult to meet his gaze. The silence stretched on for what felt like forever, but was probably only a few seconds. Daniel didn't know what to say, didn't know what to do with his hands now that they weren't on the keys. He felt exposed, vulnerable, like he'd just shown these strangers something he barely showed himself. Finally, William spoke, his voice rough and thick with emotion. "Where did you learn that piece, son?" Daniel swallowed hard, his throat tight. "I didn't learn it, sir. I wrote it. It's called Grandmother's Garden." His voice came out quieter than he intended. "She passed away 3 years ago. She was the one who taught me to play, who believed I could be a musician when everyone else thought it was a waste of time." William nodded slowly, and fresh tears spilled down his cheeks. He looked around the room at all the wealthy potential buyers, at the estate agent with her expensive suit and her business plans, at the couple who'd laughed at this young man in his thrift store jacket. Then he turned back to Daniel. "My wife used to play in this room," William said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Every evening, right around sunset. She'd sit at that exact piano and play for hours, not because anyone asked her to, not because she was performing for an audience. She played because she said music was the only honest thing in a dishonest world, the only thing that couldn't lie or cheat or pretend to be something it wasn't." He paused, his fingers tightening on his cane. The room remained silent, everyone hanging on his words. "She died 2 years ago. William continued. And since then, nobody has touched that piano. I couldn't bear to hear it without her playing it. I couldn't bear to sit in this room at all. That's why I decided to sell the house, sell everything. I thought maybe if it all went to new people, new lives, I could finally let go of the past. The estate agent looked nervous now, sensing where this might be going. She opened her mouth to speak, but William held up one hand, silencing her. I was wrong, he said, and his voice grew stronger, more certain. I was wrong about a lot of things. William turned to address the entire room, making eye contact with each person gathered there. The potential buyers, the real estate professionals, the art collectors and investment analysts, people who'd come here seeing nothing but dollar signs and business opportunities. I'm withdrawing the house from sale, William announced, and the words fell like a bomb in the quiet room. Effective immediately, the estate agent actually gasped. Mr. Whitmore, you can't be serious. We have contracts, we have people who've already submitted preliminary offers. This is highly irregular. You'll face legal. I'll face whatever I need to face, William interrupted, his voice firm despite his age. This is still my property, and I'm still of sound mind despite what my lawyers might argue. I'm not selling to people who want to gut this place and turn it into condos or some trendy hotel. My wife would haunt me from the grave. He turned back to Daniel, who was still sitting at the piano, completely frozen in shock. Young man, I don't even know your name, William said with a slight smile. Daniel, sir. Daniel Peterson. Well, Daniel Peterson, I have a proposition for you. William's eyes were sharp now, clear and focused despite the tears. How would you like a job? Daniel blinked, certain he'd misheard. I'm sorry, what? A job, William repeated. A real one. One that actually values what you can do. The room erupted. The estate agent started protesting loudly about legal obligations and binding agreements. Some of the potential buyers began complaining, pulling out their phones to call their lawyers. The couple who'd been laughing earlier looked absolutely stunned, whispering urgently to each other. But William ignored all of them, keeping his attention focused entirely on Daniel. I've been thinking about my legacy, the old man said, what I'm going to leave behind when I'm gone. I don't have children, don't have any family left. I was going to leave everything to some foundation that would probably just waste it on administrative costs and fundraising dinners. But you just reminded me what my wife always knew. Music matters. Beauty matters. Honesty matters. He gestured around the room with his cane. This mansion has been in my family for 3 generations. 75 years of Whitmore's living in these walls. And it deserves better than being torn apart and sold off in pieces. It deserves to continue being a place where music lives, where it breathes, where it touches people the way you just touched everyone in this room. Daniel felt like he was dreaming. This couldn't be real. Things like this didn't happen to people like him. I'm going to establish a foundation, William continued, his voice growing more animated, more alive than it had been since they'd met. The Whitmore Music Foundation. This house will become a conservatory and performance space, a place where working musicians, real artists who are struggling to make it, can come to practice and teach and perform. People like you who have talent but not opportunity, who have passion but not connections. He pointed at Daniel with his cane. And you're going to run it. You'll be the resident director and the house pianist. You'll help me choose which musicians to support, what programs to offer, how to make this place what it should be. The estate agent had gone pale. Mr. Whitmore, this is insane. Do you have any idea what the property taxes alone will be paid by the foundation's endowment? William finished. I'm not a fool, Margaret. I have more money than I could spend in 3 lifetimes. More than enough to keep this place running for decades after I'm gone. The only question is what I'm going to do with it. And I just found my answer. He looked back at Daniel, waiting. Daniel's mind was racing. This was impossible. This was insane. This was everything he'd ever dreamed of and nothing he'd ever expected. His hands were still shaking from the performance, and now his whole body had joined in. I don't understand, he managed to say. You don't even know me. You don't know if I'm qualified or responsible or... I know you can play, William said simply. I know you understand what music is supposed to be. And I know that when you sat down at that piano, you didn't see a valuable asset or an investment opportunity. You saw something beautiful that deserved to be heard. That's enough for me. Daniel couldn't speak. His mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. He looked around the room at all the shocked faces staring back at him. then down at his hands still resting on the keys of the magnificent Steinway. This had to be some kind of joke, or maybe he'd fallen asleep back in his cramped apartment and was having the most vivid dream of his life. William was still waiting for an answer, his expression patient but expectant. The estate agent Margaret looked like she might explode at any moment. Her face had gone from pale to bright red, and she was furiously typing something on her phone, probably messaging the lawyers she'd threatened to call. "Sir? I don't know what to say." Daniel finally managed. "This is incredibly generous, but I work as a waiter. I've never run anything in my life. I wouldn't even know where to start with something like this." A small smile crossed William's weathered face. "My wife didn't know how to run a charity when she started her literacy program 30 years ago. She just knew it needed to exist, and she figured out the rest as she went. You'll have help. I'll have help. We'll hire people who know about the business side of things. What I need from you is the heart of it, the music, the understanding of what struggling artists actually need." He gestured toward the window, toward the overgrown garden beyond. "This house has been empty of purpose for too long. My wife filled it with life, with music, with meaning. After she died, I let it become a mausoleum, a shrine to the past. But that's not what she would have wanted. She always said that beauty was meant to be shared, not locked away." Daniel felt tears pricking at his eyes. He thought about his grandmother, about all those hours she'd spent sitting beside him at their old piano, encouraging him to keep going even when his fingers fumbled and the notes came out wrong. She'd worked herself to exhaustion to give him opportunities she'd never had. And here he was, being offered something so far beyond anything she could have imagined. "Can I ask you something?" Daniel said quietly. "Why me?" "I'm sure there are hundreds of more qualified musicians in this city. People who went to better schools, who have more experience, who actually know what they're doing." William lowered himself carefully into a nearby chair, his bones creaking with the movement. He was quiet for a moment, gathering his thoughts. The room remained silent, everyone still processing what was happening. "Do you know what my wife told me on her deathbed?" William asked. "She said she regretted not being braver with her music. She was a brilliant pianist, classically trained, could have had a career if she'd wanted one, but her family didn't approve. Said it wasn't appropriate for a woman of her social standing to perform publicly, so she married me, played in this room for her own enjoyment, and convinced herself that was enough." His voice cracked slightly, but it wasn't enough. She had so much to give, so much talent that the world never got to hear, because she listened to people who told her to be practical, to be sensible, to know her place, and now she's gone and all that music died with her. William looked directly at Daniel. "When you played just now, I heard that same fire my wife had. That same desperate need to make something beautiful even when the world doesn't seem to care. You could have played it safe, chosen some classical piece to show off your technical skills, but you didn't. You played something true, something that mattered to you. That's rare. That's what this place needs." Margaret had stopped typing and was now whispering urgently with one of the potential buyers, a silver-haired man in an expensive suit. They kept glancing over at William and Daniel, clearly plotting something. Daniel tried to ignore them, but it was hard not to feel like he was causing some kind of disaster. "Mr. Whitmore," Daniel said carefully, "I'm incredibly honored, but I need to be honest with you. I'm about to be evicted from my apartment. I'm barely making rent as it is. I can't afford to take a job that might not work out. I have student loans, I have bills, You'll have a salary," William interrupted. "A real one. Enough to live on comfortably. Plus housing." Daniel's heart skipped. "Housing? This mansion has 12 bedrooms, William said with a slight chuckle. "I'm only using one of them. There's a guest house out back that nobody's lived in for years. It's yours if you want it. Rent-free. You can bring your piano, set it up however you like. Consider it part of your compensation." The world seemed to tilt sideways. Daniel gripped the edge of the piano bench to steady himself. A salary, a place to live. His own space where he could practice whenever he wanted without worrying about noise complaints or landlords selling buildings out from under him. It was too much. It was everything. "I need to think about this," Daniel heard himself say, even though every fiber of his being was screaming to say yes immediately. "This is a huge decision. Life-changing. I need at least a few days to—" "Take a week," William said. "But I'll need an answer by next Saturday. I'm 83 years old, Daniel. I don't have time to waste." Margaret suddenly stepped forward, her phone clutched in one hand like a weapon. "Mr. Whitmore, I've just spoken with your nephew, Gerald. He's very concerned about this decision. He thinks perhaps you're not thinking clearly, that the emotion of the moment. Gerald is concerned about his inheritance, William said flatly. He's been waiting for me to die so he can sell this place and buy himself a yacht or whatever ridiculous toy he's been eyeing lately. Well, he can keep waiting. The old man pushed himself to his feet, using his cane for support. Despite his age, there was something commanding about his presence. This meeting is over. All of you can leave. Margaret, you'll receive formal notification from my lawyers by Monday about the cancellation of the sale. I'll cover any costs associated with breaking the existing agreements. The room erupted in protests. The silver-haired businessman started talking about lawsuits. Margaret was frantically making phone calls. The couple who'd laughed at Daniel earlier were arguing with each other about whether they should have tried to buy the piano separately. It was chaos, and Daniel sat frozen at the piano, watching it all unfold around him. William ignored the commotion completely. He walked over to Daniel and held out his hand. "Walk with me for a moment?" Daniel took the offered hand, surprised by how strong the old man's grip was, and followed him out of the music room. They walked slowly down the hallway, leaving the angry voices behind. William led him through a door Daniel hadn't noticed before, and suddenly they were outside in the overgrown garden. It was beautiful in a wild, untamed way. Rose bushes had grown into massive tangles. Stone pathways were cracked and covered with moss. A fountain stood in the center, dry and filled with leaves, but still elegant in its decay. You could see what it had been, what it could be again with some care and attention. "My wife planted most of these," William said, gesturing at the garden with his cane. She said gardens and music were similar. Both needed patience, both needed care, both needed someone who understood that the most beautiful things take time to grow. They walked in silence for a moment, the sounds of argument still faintly audible from the house. "I know this seems sudden," William said. "I know you probably think I'm a crazy old man making decisions based on one emotional moment. Maybe you're right, but I've spent the last 2 years doing the practical thing, the sensible thing, listening to lawyers and accountants and nephews who see everything as numbers on a spreadsheet. And you know what? It made me miserable." He stopped walking and turned to face Daniel. "When you played that piano, it was the first time in 2 years I felt my wife's presence in this house. The first time I remembered what it was like when these rooms were filled with music and life instead of dust and silence. That's worth more to me than any amount of money." Daniel felt his throat tighten. "I'm scared," he admitted. "I'm scared I'll mess this up. I'm scared I'm not good enough. I'm scared you'll realize you made a mistake and I'll be right back where I started. Except now I'll know what I lost." William smiled, and it transformed his whole face. "Good, fear means you care. Fear means it matters. The only people who aren't scared are the ones who have nothing to lose." He paused, looking back at the house. "My wife used to tell me that the biggest tragedy in life isn't failing at something you tried. It's succeeding at something that never mattered in the first place." They stood in the garden for a few more minutes, not talking, just existing in the space together. Daniel could hear birds singing in the overgrown bushes, could smell roses and earth and the promise of rain. For the first time in months, maybe years, he felt something other than anxiety about the future. He felt possibility. When they walked back inside, the house had cleared out. Margaret and the potential buyers had left, probably to consult with their lawyers and plan their next moves. Only one person remained, a young woman Daniel hadn't really noticed during all the commotion. She was maybe a few years older than him, dressed professionally but not ostentatiously, and she was taking notes on a tablet. "Daniel, this is Amy Chen," William said. "She's my personal assistant and the only person in my employment who has both a brain and a soul. If you decide to take this job, she'll help you with everything you need. Paperwork, logistics, finding the right people to hire. She's the one who actually keeps things running around here." Amy smiled and extended her hand. "It's nice to meet you, Daniel. That was a beautiful performance. I recorded it if you don't mind. I thought you might want to remember this day." Daniel shook her hand, still feeling like he was moving through a dream. "Thank you, I think. I'm still not entirely sure what just happened." "You just changed your life," William said simply. "Now you have a week to decide if you're brave enough to let it stay changed." The week that followed was the strangest of Daniel's life. He went to work at the restaurant like always, but everything felt different. He moved through his shifts in a daze, carrying plates and refilling drinks while his mind spun with possibilities and fears. His coworkers noticed something was off, but he couldn't bring himself to explain. What would he even say? That some elderly millionaire had offered to make him the director of a music foundation based on one impromptu performance? They'd think he'd lost his mind. He told his brother Robert about it over dinner 3 days later. He'd expected skepticism, maybe even mockery. But Robert just sat there quietly listening to the whole story. "Are you going to do it?" Robert finally asked. "I don't know," Daniel admitted. "It seems too good to be true. Things like this don't happen to people like me." Robert was quiet for a moment, then said something Daniel never expected. "You know what Mom told me once? She said she worried about you, but not because you were chasing a dream. She worried because you were too good at making yourself small, at accepting less than you deserved because you didn't want to seem greedy or unrealistic." He leaned forward. "Daniel, I've spent my whole life being practical. Building a business, making money, checking all the boxes society says you're supposed to check. And you know what? I'm successful and I'm stable and I'm also kind of miserable because I don't have anything that makes me feel the way you look when you're playing piano." Daniel felt tears welling up. "What if I fail?" "Then you fail," Robert said with a shrug. "And you'll still have tried something amazing. That's more than most people ever do." On Tuesday night, Daniel played his regular gig at the Riverside Coffee House. Betty, the owner, could tell something was different. After his set, she sat down across from him with 2 cups of coffee. "You're leaving," she said. It wasn't a question. Daniel nodded. "I think so. I haven't decided for sure, but yeah, probably." Betty smiled, and there was sadness in it, but also genuine happiness. "Good. You've always been too talented for this place. I mean, I love having you here, but you deserve a bigger stage." "It's not really a bigger stage," Daniel tried to explain. "It's different. It's running a whole program helping other musicians." "It's where you're supposed to be," Betty interrupted. "I can see it on your face. You've already decided. You're just scared to admit it." She was right. Daniel realized he'd made his decision days ago, maybe even in the moment when William first made the offer. Everything since then had just been fear trying to talk him out of it. On Saturday morning, Daniel drove back to the Whitmore estate. His old car made concerning noises the whole way, and he thought about how he might finally be able to afford to fix it. Or maybe even get a different one. The thought felt surreal. William was waiting for him in the garden. He looked up as Daniel approached, his expression carefully neutral, but there was hope in his eyes. "I want to do it," Daniel said before he could lose his nerve. "I want to take the job. I want to help build this foundation. I'm terrified and I have no idea what I'm doing, but yes. My answer is yes." The smile that spread across William's face was like sunrise. Good, I was hoping you'd say that. I may have already had Amy start drawing up the paperwork." Over the next 6 months, Daniel's life transformed in ways he couldn't have imagined. The guest house became his home, and he moved his grandmother's old piano into the sunlit front room where he could practice whenever inspiration struck. The mansion itself underwent careful renovation, turning bedrooms into practice studios and sitting rooms into intimate performance spaces, all while preserving the character and beauty of the original structure.